So some say that he tweets only twice every year. What we know is that he's an entrepreneur with a passion for all things tech. He graduated from the University of Cambridge and co-founded PeoplePerHour, where he served as a CTO for the past 6 years, helping it to make one of the top online services marketplaces globally today. Prior to PeoplePerHour, Simos had a successful career as a management consultant with Accenture, where he worked on a wide variety of projects. At this point, I must add that PeoplePerHour was one of the first supporters of Sales Hack Cyprus 2012, and hopefully will be one for years to come. Simos will talk about the importance of cloud computing. To cloud or not to cloud? That is the question. Simos, floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I have a tough job. I'm the last one of the day, and I know we're running late, so I'll try and keep it short and sweet. Before we start, though, it would be good for me to know how many of you are kind of techies, and how many of you perhaps have a show of hand if you consider yourself a techie or know what Amazon Cloud is. Okay, so it's what I expect. It's a mixed bag. So I won't go into a lot of technical detail because I'm really scared for the rest of you. I think you definitely fall asleep. But do feel free to ask me questions as we go along if you have more technical questions. I had an intro about me, so I'm not going to say too much apart from that. I'll talk to you a bit about PeoplePerHour, not because I'm promoting it, although I am, but I consider this to be a kind of cloud, and I want you to think about the cloud a bit differently, especially living in Cyprus, as you see from Kostas. There's a couple of challenges that are really, really difficult living in Cyprus if you want to be in the online space, especially, online space, if you have a product. First of all, there's no critical mass of people for many services. And the second thing is that many times you need machinery, like you've seen from Kostas. And until maybe 5-10 years ago, it wasn't very different in the online space as well. So launching something from Cyprus was a very, very daunting task. Luckily, it's not the same these days. So this is why this stuff is really important. PeoplePerHour is the same thing. It's kind of a human cloud. If you think about it, you can be in your bedroom in the same way as you can get servers from people from Amazon. You can get people around the world to work on a per hour basis and build various things for you. If you want a logo or any kind of design or programmers, you don't really need to be really well funded these days. You can start very, very small and lean. I think it's hugely important. This is why the cloud or crowdsourcing is very, very in these days, and is particularly important, I think, for Cyprus. PeoplePerHour is a marketplace for services. You can read stuff on the, I'm not going to go too much into it. For the techies, we're built in PHP and MySQL. We've got iPhone and Android apps, and we're now 100% on Amazon Web Services. I'm going to use the acronym AWS for that going forward. We've got over 500,000 registered users, which is in the business domain is not insignificant. And there's two main locations for the staff: is UK and Greece. And again, this is also important for choosing any kind of cloud infrastructure these days. And I'll explain a bit further why. Can I have a show of hands, please? Who's running already maybe an online company or a website, or even if as a hobby? Okay, thank you. To some, this might make sense. To others, it might not. But I'm just going to walk you through our evolution in PeoplePerHour. So we started in 2007. At the time, shared servers was the cheapest thing we could get. And after we managed to get a bit of money, including our own money, we managed to get our first dedicated server, which was great news for me because I was a CTO and I wanted machinery. We didn't have it in our office, of course. But the first disappointment came soon after, when we eventually, after really hard work, we managed to get featured in the BBC News. And I watched in horror the site melt down. It was not a pretty picture. We tried our best to prepare for it, but I saw a couple of zeros on the server load and then a blank screen, and then the website wouldn't load anymore, which for anybody that's put a lot of work into trying to get some exposure is not where you want to be. We managed to get pretty good results out of that, but I promised myself that I would find a better way as soon as we could to make things work. So from 2009 to 2011, we had a more traditional managed hosting arrangement where you were renting servers on a yearly basis. You make a contract if you don't know how it works, and you commit for about a year, or if you're lucky for a bit shorter. But I was really, really frustrated at the time. It was very difficult for me to predict what's going to happen with the business. We were growing, making new deals. The traffic kept on multiplying. There were quiet months. It was just a bit frustrating having to commit for so long. And also, at the same time, I was closely following the whole cloud computing evolution, if you'd like. And then from 2012, we moved to Amazon Web Services, which was a great step. I'll talk about it a bit further along. Just before I move on to the next slide, how many of you actually know what cloud computing is? Okay, so I'm not going to spend that long on this next slide. Apart from saying that it is a fairly loose term, I guess in the commercial world, we mean Amazon or one of the other providers like Google or Microsoft. But a couple of really important things from this slide is that obviously cloud computing is based on virtualization, which basically means that you don't really need to care about the underlying servers. So it's not like Costas, unfortunately, where you had to buy machines and everything like that. These days, you can just buy computing power literally and pay by the hour. It sounds very straightforward these days. It wasn't always the case, but it is quite a significant leap if you think about it in terms of technology. And it does make the internet tick. Is the stuff that makes a lot of the companies you've seen run behind the scenes. And Amazon and the other cloud providers are in really stiff competition these days, because this is, in many people's perception, the future, and in mine as well. Now, in terms of PeoplePerHour, I'm just going to walk you through a bit of the reasons we chose eventually to move to Amazon. It's really mind-boggling the speed at which new services are provided. I mean, I haven't looked at it in about a month now. I've been on holiday for a few weeks, and I'm sure there's a lot more things that have been launched by Amazon and the other cloud providers in the last month alone. So it is a bit like having an army of clever people working for you and innovating on your behalf, and then you get to just literally use the services and pay for even an hour if you want. It's very, very important if you're an entrepreneur, because you want to try things out. You've seen the presentation earlier on. It's all about trying things and failing fast. With this kind of power, you can just launch something, try it for a few hours, and then just shut everything down, and you don't have to pay for the servers or anything like that afterwards. It caters for most of the infrastructure needs, including what we had in PeoplePerHour. You pay for what you use per hour. We like paying per hour against our company as well. And another really, really important thing is that it does allow you to focus on your core product. You don't have to worry about maintaining servers. You don't have to worry about what you need to launch, how it's going to scale. It's all there and it's done for you. For those of you who are techies, this was a kind of typical setup that we had at PeoplePerHour, and it's still very similar to this. This is all on Amazon, so there are virtual services, especially provided by Amazon, and then you have a couple of automation tools like Puppet, which you've seen there, which basically means that we can scale up and down the website very, very quickly. It's very important because, especially as you grow bigger, you have quiet periods and you have very busy periods, especially like the BBC experience I've mentioned. And if you're renting service, it does get very quickly very expensive. With this kind of technology, you can actually say if it's Christmas Day and you want to pay a bit less, you just bring down the number of resources you use to a minimum, and then you just pay for what you use. Are there any questions up to now? Is it making sense? Good. Got a thumbs up. I'll take that. I'm not going to go too much into this because I know, again, we're running a bit late, but basically they're a very diverse set of services provided by cloud providers these days. And one other great thing is that you can bring everything under the same roof. Before we moved to Amazon, I had a DNS service with one provider, the service with another. We had all sorts of different kind of solutions. It's really, really easy with Amazon. I'm one of these people that's not really scared to commit, so I'd rather I use up everything they give me and not worry too much about being locked in. A lot of people say don't use Amazon stuff or any really particular stuff. I don't personally agree, but it's kind of what you believe really. But we found really a lot of solutions that we could implement very quickly by leveraging what Amazon gives. Of course, there is a slight downside in the sense that if you ever want to move away from Amazon to somebody else, if you use too much of their proprietary stuff, you might be a bit locked in and have to engineer some stuff to get out of that situation. But from my experience so far, I haven't looked back since we moved to Amazon. So the advantages we got out of this was, I think, far outweigh the potential disadvantage if we ever want to move off. A couple of services I think that if you're starting today might be, I've chosen a couple of really kind of basic building blocks. It's impossible to go into everything, but I'd really recommend RDS is the database solution by Amazon. It has an amazing, it sounds very straightforward, things like taking backups. It's things that if you're starting a startup today, you're trying to do yourself, you always have in the back of your mind, especially if you're the CTO, especially if you get calls at 3 o'clock in the morning saying things are down, you always start questioning yourself. So it's very important to, these things are lifesavers in many ways. I mean, for example, having a second database server ready to key into action was something we tried quite a few times with various levels of success, and it's something that's provided automatically for you as long as you pay for it. S3, I think, is a service that perhaps deserves a bit of attention. We moved our images. It was the first time we flirted with Amazon. So even when we had our own managed servers, we moved on to S3 our images first because it was the first growing pain we had. And it sounds like such a simple service. It's just basically you chuck a lot of files into it and it kind of grows without you having to worry. And I would strongly recommend if you're starting something, even if you can't be or don't want to be on Amazon or one of the other cloud providers from day one, at least consider use some building blocks like S3 because they will make your life a lot easier. And it's absolutely critical. You don't want to be worrying about how to scale certain file servers and things like that further down the line, especially if that's not your core competence. So it's not rocket science. It's very, cloud is a kind of misused term. It makes it sound like rocket science. It's not. I would really recommend you take a look at it. It will make your life a lot easier along the path. So this is another example. If I move away from the technical, we relaunched the whole PeoplePerHour site in 2011 in July, which meant basically that we went through a few months of rebuilding everything, which is quite scary, and probably the wise thing is never to do it, but we felt that the product had reached the point where it needed a complete overhaul. So we did that in July 2012, and honestly, if we were not on Amazon, I don't know how we'd launch it, because it enabled us very quickly to launch complete replicas of the site, test it for a few hours of the new site, and know that when we put it live, it would be fine. We could even divert users between the old and the new site and have everything up and running. All that happened is that we had a big deal with Amazon for 1 month, and then so July was a very expensive month for us, but that was it. I mean, we didn't have to, buy lots of servers and run them or even rent them for a year, sign long-term contracts and all that. So we did a lot of performance testing. We could just launch the servers for a couple of hours. You need to be careful because it's great. It gives you all this capacity, you can launch as many servers as your heart desires, and your money will also disappear in the cloud. So you have to be quite frugal, but it is very, very powerful. And just to give you a contrast, in February 2013, bear in mind that we had a lot more traffic than our initial experience in 2007 by that point. So we were featured on BBC Breakfast and BBC News on the same day. I was actually waiting for this moment for about 6 years. So, I got up at about 5 o'clock on Saturday morning and launched a lot of servers just to make sure that we stayed up. And it was probably a bit wasteful in that I think we weren't a bit too crazy in the end, because everything was really comfortable in terms of load. But you can see the kind of spikes you can anticipate. So you can see up until 6 o'clock in the morning, we had very few traffic, then we got a huge spike, and then the traffic continued being quite high for a normal day for us. And then 10:30, it was another mention. And this went on and on throughout the day, so we kept on getting mentions in the BBC Breakfast and BBC World. These things keep on being repeated. And to be honest, I think we didn't break a sweat. We were just basically monitoring things, but nothing was there to trouble us, which is very, very reassuring, especially if you know that you can handle the multiples of traffic, multiple times the traffic that you handle on a busy day. So all that happened was that we kept them for a couple of days, and then when the traffic went down, we just scaled down to our normal level. So we had an expensive day and great exposure, which was totally worth it. And we couldn't have done it with traditional hosting. Literally, it would have taken me just a couple of weeks to negotiate a contract for new servers, and then that would have tied me in for a year. Other examples as well, you can see here, for some reason, we ended up 2012 on a very good note. Actually, I didn't put absolute numbers, but it was on really good traffic for us. And then January, without any extra marketing or anything like that, it looks a bit like a horizontal line, but if you see the level of traffic from perhaps mid-December to January, it was about double the traffic, and we didn't again have to worry about this kind of seasonal variations. It's something that we just launched a few more servers, and then we scaled them down when we needed to. So it's the kind of thing that in the real world these things will happen. If you have any kind of usage pattern, any traffic that is seasonal or even during the day, typically you get a ton of traffic during the day, and then you get very little traffic during the night. You can really scale down your expenses during the night and not having to pay for all these expensive servers. So I think against perhaps the mood, I will try and attempt to give some advice. Take it with a pinch of salt. This is just based on my experience. But if I was to say today whether you should be on the cloud or not, if you're doing any kind of online venture, I would say that ask yourself the question of why not be in the cloud. It's not so much the question of why be in the cloud anymore. I think it's why not use the cloud. I think ideally you should try and be on some kind of cloud hosting from day one. I've put there cost per meeting because there's much cheaper solutions if you want to go at it. So I understand that not everybody can perhaps afford it on the early days. But if you can, you should try and build at least some part of your infrastructure, or at least think about it from day one. There's quite a few businesses that I think are very, very important. If you're building anything that's data intensive, you anticipate a lot of data as you grow, or a lot of kind of computing, needing a lot of computing power, you should definitely be on the cloud. It's just going to make your life so much easier, and potentially make all the difference between you having spent half your life trying to scale or focusing on your core product and your customers. Also, if you have any very uneven usage patterns, for example, there's some products, I was talking to a few guys that do very intensive processing to present like analytics and stuff like that. So there's times where you need to launch a bunch of servers do a lot of computing, get the results, and then store the results. These are just ideal use cases for the cloud. So give it some thought, and I think there's no real alternative these days to this kind of use cases unless you're quite big. As I've said, if you're not on the cloud yet, you can at least use some services like S3. And another great thing is that you could just use very cheap or even free these days servers from these companies for your dev and staging environments. So a lot of companies give you the smallest instances they can for a year for nothing. So you can just try things out and pay literally zero. If you're not on cloud and or you think you're not on cloud, because sometimes you might be on something else that is eventually built on some cloud deployment somewhere. But there's no need to stress. You can move to the cloud. I would definitely urge you to think about their architecture from day one. Think about the architecture that you have and how you could break it out. I've put scaled out. Maybe some of you would have heard of these terms. The current trends are scaling out, which means getting quite a few servers rather than just bigger, expensive machines. So if you can scale out on inexpensive hardware like Amazon's, you'll have a lot less scaling troubles in the future. If you rely on more and more expensive machines and more powerful machines, you'll quickly find out that there is a paradox in computing. If you go to a hosting provider and you want to get a server that has 10 times the amount of memory and CPU power, you will pay more than 10 times the price. So you don't get economies of scale, you get exactly the opposite. The bigger machines you ask, the more expensive they become, disproportionately expensive. So I've seen companies that I'm trying to help out that are stuck with huge machines that cost thousands every month to run, whereas they could be on a lot smaller machines, but more of them. A few tips on when you should think about moving. If you're having some trouble scaling, is the obvious one. If you're really frustrated about your hosting arrangement, I had a brilliant relationship with a hosting company, but ultimately, they were in a different kind of business and they wanted to have some certainty for at least 6 months or a year on their servers, which really didn't fit our use case at PeoplePerHour. We need to change things fairly dynamically. If you're spending too much time or money on infrastructure problems and employ an army of people worrying about servers, it's probably a good idea to have a think. If you really love the features that are coming out, which is, I put there as a half joke, saying cool out loud when reading about cloud features, but literally I was following Amazon's evolution for a few years, and every single time they were bringing out something new, it was something that was hitting home at different stages of the company. It was something that I had felt the pain. So if you're in that position, it's probably a good sign that it's time to consider moving. I won't talk too much about choices. I'm sure you can research them. There's quite a few. There's Amazon is still the leader. There's Google. There's Microsoft. There's niche players like Heroku these days. It's very, very easy to find them online. Personally, I went with Amazon because I found they were basically they were innovating very, very quickly, and they were bringing out a lot of services that were extremely relevant to startups. I don't know if it's the same for enterprise or different types of use cases, but for startups, I definitely recommend them. And lastly, a few tips and practices, best practices. You do need to think about you do try to be on the cloud, just think about it a bit differently than traditional hosting. In traditional hosting, you usually have one server that you're completely in control of. You know how much load is getting, it's going to be there. In cloud computing, things tend to disappear from time to time or slow down, so you need to think about your architecture accordingly and not rely on 100% certainty. It's definitely possible, like on Amazon, for example, you can have different machines, smaller machines, but more on different locations. You can be in Europe, you can be in the US. So if you've seen some well-publicized downtimes from very, very prominent companies, sometimes you can really guard against these things by making sure you're geographically spread and have more presence on what they call availability zones. I definitely recommend using an automation orchestration tool like Puppet or Chef if you can. It will mean that you have something in your infrastructure that can be actually coded rather than configured all the time. It will make your life so much easier. You won't have to rely on wikis and many, many nodes on knowing how to configure your servers. And it does mean that you can bring up servers very, very quickly. In terms of cost, again, you only pay for 1 hour, so you can really experiment with different sizes of instances or server on Amazon to see what really fits your needs. It's not very straightforward. We tried many different setups, and then against all odds, we found a setup that we didn't think would be the most cost-effective for us, but it was. It just depends on the nature of your application. But it's so easy to throw in a few servers in the mix, see how they perform against the servers you've had already, how much you're paying, how much the load is, and see how much traffic they can take. In many of these cloud providers, you can also commit for a number of months or typically a year. So if you do have any servers you can commit for a year, they do become very, very cheap compared to their standard per hour offering. So you are paying for that flexibility, so it's worth keeping that in mind. So I think I've kept it quite short. So if there's any questions, either technical or kind of more general, I'd love to do my best to answer them. And like I've said, there's definitely no stupid questions, so don't ask about caps lock. Is anybody using Amazon out of curiosity? Okay, so quite a few people. Are you happy? Good. Thank you very much.